The wolf was the first mistake. She lay across my porch with a clinical, heavy stillness, her silver fur dusted with the first frost of a Colorado October. No blood, no struggle, just a message delivered with the kind of silent efficiency that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Someone had breached my perimeter, bypassed a 12-foot commercial-grade steel fence, and walked right up to my front door just to leave a 150-pound carcass as a greeting card. I didn't panic. 12 years as an Army Ranger, 6 of those as a lead sniper, burns the panic out of you. It replaces it with a cold, rhythmic assessment of the environment. I looked at the wolf, then at the treeline of the 300 acres I'd bought with every cent of my retirement savings to escape people like this. Amateurs, I whispered, my voice a low rasp in the pre-dawn quiet. You really should have checked the deed before you stepped onto the porch. I stepped back into the cabin, my hand finding the familiar weight of my binoculars before I even reached for my boots. Through the reinforced glass, I scanned the horizon. The sun was just beginning to bleed gold over the Rockies, but the silence was wrong. It wasn't the silence of nature, it was the silence of something waiting. Then came the sound, scrape, snap. The metallic screech of wire cutters against high-tensile steel. It was coming from the eastern perimeter. I checked my watch, 0530. These people were punctual. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my M24, a rifle I'd hoped to never chamber a round in again, and moved. I didn't head for the gate, I headed for the shadows. By the time I reached the breach, the intruders were gone, but they'd left a trail a blind man could follow. The fence hadn't been cut by a trespasser, it had been surgically opened. The edges were folded back with the precise geometry of a combat engineer. This wasn't a local hunter looking for elk, this was a professional team. I knelt, pressing my fingers into the soft earth, tire tracks, deep, heavy impressions. Commercial-grade treads, I noted, my mind cataloging the data. Heavily loaded, cargo vans, not recreational. The air still hung heavy with the smell of motor oil, cheap cigarettes, and an acrid chemical scent I couldn't quite place. I followed the tracks 50 yards into a dense thicket of pines and stopped. Scattered across the forest floor were industrial-grade plastic bags. Inside weren't just scraps, they were systematic collections of fur, antlers, and biological samples. Each bag was labeled with alphanumeric codes and secured with industrial zip ties. This wasn't poaching, this was an extraction. As I reached for one of the bags, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a private number. I let it ring twice before answering, my thumb hovering over the record button. Jason Kane, a voice said. It was smooth, dripping with the kind of unearned authority you only find in middle management or people who think a suit makes them a god. I believe you found our work. I found a dead wolf on my porch and a hole in my fence, I said, my voice flat, devoid of the irritation he was clearly fishing for. Usually people start with a hello or a please don't shoot me for trespassing. A dry, condescending chuckle came through the line. Mr. Kane, let's not be dramatic. I'm Marcus Thorne, head of the High Ridge Landowners Association. You've been difficult to reach. We've sent several notices regarding your security measures. This is a protected wilderness corridor. Your fence is a violation of the HOA aesthetic and ecological guidelines. I looked at the 12-foot steel barricade topped with razor wire. I own 300 acres of unincorporated mountain land, Thorne. There is no HOA here. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away. On paper, perhaps, Thorne's voice sharpened, the mask of civility slipping. But High Ridge Development recently acquired the surrounding parcels. We've grandfathered your land into the master plan community. That fence comes down today. The sampling you found is part of our mandatory environmental impact study. We have a right to be there. You, however, are currently in violation of approximately 14 bylaws. You breached a military-grade perimeter to tell me I'm violating a lawn care policy? I asked, a genuine smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. That's a bold tactical choice. We're coming up with the county sheriff to oversee the removal of the fence and the inspection of your cabin, Thorne said, his tone turning smug. I'd suggest you be waiting with the gate open. We hate to have to force entry. He hung up. I looked down at the GPS device I'd found wedged under my porch boards earlier that morning. I'd spent the last hour decoding its waypoints. It wasn't an HOA map. It was a tactical overlay. Every water source, every blind spot in my camera feed, and every one of my target practice ranges was marked with target or observation post. These weren't suburban busybodies. They were using an HOA front to mask a high-value poaching or biological harvesting operation. and they had the local law in their pocket. "Okay, Marcus," I said, looking toward the road, "let's play." An hour later, a black SUV and a marked sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust as they barreled toward my gate. I didn't meet them at the fence. I sat on my porch, cleaning my rifle, a thermos of coffee at my side. I looked like a retired soldier who had finally lost his mind. That was the version of me they wanted. Thorne stepped out of the SUV. He was exactly what I expected: Patagonia vest, expensive hiking boots that had never seen mud, and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. Beside him was a deputy who looked bored, his hand resting a little too comfortably on his holster. "Mr. Kane," Thorne shouted from behind the gate, "open up, we have the warrants for the easement inspection." I didn't move. "The gate's unlocked, Marcus, just pull the pin." He hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he motioned for the deputy to open it. They drove up the winding gravel path and parked inches from my porch. Thorne stepped out, holding a clipboard like a shield. "You're making this very difficult, Jason. The wolf? A tragedy, truly. Our scouts found it on the perimeter and moved it here so you wouldn't miss it. We thought you'd want to know about the wildlife issues your fence is causing." "You mean the wolf you drugged and dumped to see how long it would take me to react?" I asked, not looking up from my rifle. "She's not dead, by the way, she's just sedated. I moved her to the shade. She'll be quite grumpy when she wakes up in about 20 minutes. Thorne's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about, deputy, if you would." The deputy stepped forward, his voice gruff. "Kane, we've got reports of illegal structures and potential hazardous waste on this property. Step aside while we inspect the cabin." Yeah. "Hazardous waste?" I stood up slowly. I'm not a big man, but I have a way of occupying space that makes people realize they're standing in the wrong spot. "You mean the industrial chemical runoff from the sampling your boys were doing at 0300 this morning? The stuff you're using to strip the velvet off those poached antlers before you ship them to the overseas markets?" The silence that followed was heavy. The deputy's hand tightened on his belt. Thorne's eyes went cold. "You have a very active imagination, Mr. Kane," Thorne said quietly. "But you're also a trespasser on what is now HOA-regulated land. We are authorized to seize any property used in the commission of a code violation." "Is that what the GPS waypoints were for?" I pulled the small device from my pocket and tossed it at Thorne's feet. "The ones that track my movements, the ones that show your environmental scouts have been watching me sleep for 3 weeks." Thorne didn't even look at the device. "A necessary precaution for a man with your volatile history. Now move." I sighed, taking a slow sip of coffee. "You know, Marcus, I spent 12 years in the Rangers. The one thing they teach you is that intelligence is everything. You think you've been watching me, you think you've found a quiet vet who just wants to be left alone." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper. "But you never stopped to ask why I chose this specific 300 acres. Thorne frowned. "What are you talking about?" "This land isn't just unincorporated," I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. "It's a decommissioned federal testing site. I bought the surface rights, but the subsurface, that's still under Department of Defense jurisdiction. And as part of my retirement package, I'm the contracted caretaker for the seismic monitoring station buried 400 feet under your feet." I pulled out a second phone, a rugged satellite-linked unit, and held it up. "When you cut my fence this morning, you didn't just violate a bylaw. You tripped a Tier 1 federal security alarm. This entire conversation, it's being recorded by a relay in Cheyenne Mountain. The sampling your men were doing, you've been trespassing on a DOD-sanctioned research perimeter." The deputy's face went pale. "Thorne, you said this was just a private land dispute." "Shut up," Thorne hissed, but his confidence was evaporating. "He's lying, he's a crazy vet in a shack." "Am I?" I pointed toward the horizon. A low, rhythmic thrum began to vibrate in the air. It wasn't the sound of a sheriff's cruiser. It was the heavy, thumping heartbeat of twin-engine rotors. 2 Black Hawks crested the ridge, staying low, their nose-mounted cameras locked onto the SUV. "That's the quick reaction force from Fort Carson," I said, checking my watch. 13 minutes, a little slow, but they had to clear the airspace. Thorne scrambled for his SUV. "This is a mistake, we have rights, we're the Landowners Association." "You're a shell company for a black market wildlife ring," I said, finally raising the M24 not to fire but to point toward the gate. And you just broke into a federal installation to brag about it. The Black Hawks flared over the meadow, kicking up a hurricane of dust and pine needles. Tactical teams in full gear roped down before the wheels even touched the dirt. The deputy immediately put his hands in the air, dropping his belt. Thorne was frozen, his expensive clipboard flying away in the rotor wash. I sat back down on my porch, the calmest man in the county. The lead officer, a man I'd served with in Kandahar, walked up the stairs, his boots thudding on the wood. He looked at Thorne, then at the sedated wolf, then at me. "Everything okay, Kane?" he asked, his voice booming over the engines. "Just some HOA trouble, Miller," I said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "They had some concerns about the height of my fence." Miller looked at Thorne, who was currently being zip-tied by two soldiers with CID patches on their chests. "The fence seems fine to me, a bit low, actually." "I was thinking the same thing," I agreed. As they loaded Thorne into the back of a transport, his face pressed against the glass, he looked at me. For the first time, the entitlement was gone. He looked at the cabin, at the shack he thought he could bully, and finally realized that he hadn't been hunting a hermit. He'd been walking into a trap set by a man who had spent his entire life waiting for someone exactly like him to make a move. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. The wolf stirred in the shade, her yellow eyes cracking open. She looked at me, then at the chaos in the meadow. She let out a low, guttural huff and trotted back into the tree line, disappearing into the shadows like she was never there. "Hey, Miller," I called out as the soldiers finished clearing the scene. "Yes." "Tell the guys to be careful on the way out, there's a hole in the fence. I'd hate for anyone to trip." I watched them leave, the mountains returning to their silent, golden vigil. I had 300 acres of peace and quiet again, and I had a feeling the HOA wouldn't be sending any more letters.